You know what I hate?" Marcus asked, his eyes fixed on the screen of the convenience store's ancient TV. The flickering images of a rap music video played out a scene of flashy cars and gold chains. "What's that?" The cashier, Dave, barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle. "These wannabe gangsters," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration. "They think they own the place." Dave grunted in acknowledgement, scribbled something on his puzzle, and said, "It's just music, kid. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to Marcus. Every day, he watched them strut down the sidewalks, their pants hanging low, hats cocked to the side, and their mouths full of words that seemed to ooze arrogance. They took over the schoolyard, the local park, even the movie theater lobby. And every time, they'd be surrounded by a gaggle of girls, the same ones Marcus had been trying to work up the nerve to talk to for months. It was like they had some kind of magnetic pull that sucked all the attention away from everyone else. Marcus felt his fists clench. He was tired of being the invisible kid, the one nobody noticed unless they needed someone to push around. He'd had enough of watching from the sidelines as the world unfolded around him like a bad movie he couldn't change the channel on. He lived with his grandparents in a small, cluttered house that smelled faintly of mothballs and stale cookies. His grandma's knitting needles clicked away in the evenings as she watched Wheel of Fortune, and his grandpa snored like a chainsaw in the armchair next to her. Their lives were simple, and they didn't understand his anger. They'd lost their son, Marcus's father, in a senseless act of gang violence, and they had hoped that by moving away from the city, they could shield Marcus from the same fate. But the world had a way of seeping in through the cracks, bringing with it the very thing they feared most. At night, when the house was quiet, Marcus would retreat to his room and lie in bed, his thoughts racing. He'd stare at the poster of Arnold Schwarzenegger on his wall, a relic from his dad's teenage years, and feel a strange kinship with the muscular hero. In the dim light, he'd touch himself, imagining being with women with the power and confidence that came with being like the men in the movies. He'd fantasize about walking into school the next day, the kind of guy who could turn heads and make the gangsters quiver. But when he looked in the mirror, all he saw was a scrawny kid with glasses and a pocket full of comic books. The loneliness was like a heavy blanket that smothered him. His parents had died in a car accident when he was young, and his grandparents had done their best to fill the void. But their gentle guidance and endless supply of love couldn't fill the gaping hole in his chest. He yearned for the kind of excitement that seemed to follow the gangsters wherever they went, the kind of life that didn't involve listening to his grandpa's war stories or his grandma's lectures about the importance of eating your vegetables. And most of all, he craved the attention of the girls who whispered and giggled behind their hands when the gangsters swaggered by. School was a daily battleground. The hallways echoed with their taunts, and the classrooms were a minefield of rolled-up papers and spitballs. Marcus was the butt of their jokes, the target of their cruel games. They'd knock his books out of his hands and steal his lunch money, laughing as he scurried away like a kicked puppy. The teachers turned a blind eye, too overwhelmed by the sheer volume of problems to care about one more lonely kid. One day, as Marcus hurried to his locker, one of the gangsters, a kid named Tyrone, stepped in his path. His gold teeth gleamed as he sneered, "Hey, snitch boy, heard about your pops? Bet he's spinning in his grave knowing his blood's running through a pussy like you." Marcus's heart hammered in his chest, and his fists tightened around his books. He knew the rumor wasn't true. His dad had been a hard-working man who had nothing to do with the gangs. But the whispers had spread like wildfire, and now it was all anyone talked about. Tyrone's friends gathered around, a sea of smirks and sneers. Marcus's cheeks burned as he tried to ignore the sting of the words. He'd heard it all before. But this time, something inside him snapped. He looked Tyrone in the eye and said, "My dad was a hero. He didn't die because he was a snitch. He died because of scum like you." The hallway fell silent. Tyrone's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt a glimmer of power. But then Tyrone's fist shot out, catching Marcus in the jaw. He crumpled to the floor, the wind knocked out of him. The gangsters erupted into laughter, and the crowd of students parted like the Red Sea, leaving Marcus alone in a puddle of his own drool. As he picked himself up, a fury grew in his chest, hot and all-consuming. He'd show them. He'd make them all regret the day they ever laid eyes on him. He'd become the kind of person who didn't just watch life happen, he'd make it happen for himself. And he knew exactly how to do it. Marcus had always been a Republican, raised by his grandparents who had instilled in him the values of hard work, self-reliance, and law and order. The gangster lifestyle, with its disregard for the rules and its glorification of violence and theft, was everything he despised. It represented the chaos that had claimed his father's life and the reason his mother had to work 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Every time he saw those gangsters with their flashy clothes and swagger, it was like a knife twisting in his gut, a reminder of the world's cruel indifference to the struggle of good, decent people. He'd always been a solitary kid, but now his solitude felt like a prison. He needed a way out, a path to power. And so he turned to the only thing he knew could give it to him, the movies. Marcus had seen Taxi Driver 100 times, the story of a man who took matters into his own hands to clean up the streets. The film had become a sacred text to him, a manual for transformation. If Travis Bickle could do it, so could he. He started lifting weights in his garage, his grandpa's old set that had been gathering dust since before he was born. The iron bars clanked and groaned under his newfound strength, each repetition a declaration of war against the world that had wronged him. He studied the way Bickle moved, the cold, calculated precision of his every action. He practiced his stare in the mirror, the one that could make anyone feel like they were the only person in the room. And he watched the news, his eyes narrowing at every story of gang violence, every smug mugshot of a thug who'd gotten away with it. He saved his allowance and bought a gun from a shady dealer behind the gas station. It was heavy in his hand, a cold, metal promise of justice. He knew he couldn't take them all on, not yet. But he could start small, make them pay for the way they treated him, for the way they treated his dad. He'd show them that he wasn't some weak little kid. He was Marcus, the Avenger, the one who'd bring the hammer down on their world of chaos. And he'd do it in a way that was so clean, so surgical, they'd never see it coming. The anticipation grew in him like a fever, his mind racing with scenarios and strategies. He'd wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to make his move. And when he did, the world would finally see him for who he truly was. The lonely boy who'd been pushed too far, now a man with a mission. The gangsters had picked the wrong kid to mess with. They'd picked a kid who had nothing to lose, and everything to prove. Marcus dubbed it Reconciliation Day, a twisted nod to the peace he hoped to bring to his own life by eliminating the scum that had made it a living hell. He knew that one gun wouldn't be enough. He needed firepower that would make a statement, something that would strike fear into the hearts of the thugs that ruled the schoolyard. He began to research, his eyes scanning over articles and forums on the internet, learning about the weapons that could deliver the kind of power he craved. His heart pounded at the thought of wielding an automatic weapon, something like a Mach 11, compact and deadly. It was the kind of gun that could turn the tables on his tormentors in an instant. Days turned into weeks, and his training intensified. He spent every waking moment preparing for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. His muscles grew, his reflexes sharpened, and his resolve hardened. The weight of the gun in his hand became a comfort, a symbol of the power he was about to unleash. He practiced drawing it from his waistband, the smooth motion as natural as breathing. The clack of the safety being flicked off was a sweet symphony to his ears. He'd stand in front of the mirror, his face contorted into a snarl, whispering the words he'd say to Tyrone when the time came. But his attempts to mimic the iconic Taxi Driver's hidden gun devices were a failure. The duct tape and coat hangers he'd MacGyvered together were clumsy and unreliable. He needed something more professional, more intimidating. So he settled for a simple yet effective solution, a black leather jacket with a secret pocket for his pistol and a nondescript backpack for the Mach 11. It was a nod to his favorite movie without the over-the-top theatrics. He'd play it cool, like Bickle, but with a modern twist. Marcus took his frustrations to Dave, the kind-hearted store owner who'd always offered him a safe haven from the schoolyard bullies. "They're like a disease," Marcus said, slamming a can of soda on the counter. "They're ruining everything." Dave looked up from his newspaper, his eyes wise and knowing. "Son, you can't go down that road. They're just kids playing tough. It's all talk, most of the time." "But it's not just talk," Marcus insisted, his voice edging on desperation. "They're dangerous." Dave leaned on the counter, his gaze softening. "I know you're hurting, and I know you want to do something. But you can't fight fire with fire. God has a plan, and he'll serve them their justice when the time is right. You just keep your head down and keep being the good kid you are." Marcus nodded, his thoughts racing. He knew Dave was right, but the anger in him was like a wild beast, demanding to be unleashed. He'd thought about calling off Reconciliation Day, maybe just forgetting about it all and moving on. But then, 2 days later, the unthinkable happened. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked Tyrone and his goons. They strutted around the store, knocking over displays and grabbing candy bars, stuffing them into their pockets. Marcus felt his blood boil, his hand itching for the gun in his pocket. But before he could act, Dave stepped in, his voice firm but calm. "You boys need to pay for that." Tyrone sneered. "Or what, old man?" Dave's eyes narrowed, and he reached under the counter. Marcus's heart stopped. He knew what was there. The old revolver that Dave kept for protection. But it was too late. Tyrone's hand shot out, grabbing